God told Solomon that his temple would end in ruins on the day of its inauguration. It wasn't an angry prophet who announced it. It wasn't an enemy. It was the divine response, recorded in chapter 9 of the first book of Kings, just as the most glorious ceremony in Israel's history had concluded. The text says that house would become a heap of ruins, and that everyone who passed by it would be appalled and would hiss. And then God does something nobody expects. He puts an exact question in the mouths of those strangers. Why did the Lord do this to this land and to this house? There is the key that almost nobody sees, because the following 47 chapters are not a chronicle of reigns. They are the answer to that question. The entire book of Kings exists to answer one single thing that God anticipated in chapter 9. What would have to happen for him to deliver his own house to the fire? And the answer arrives 4 centuries later, when the city burns, the people are deported, and the account ends in the most unexpected place in the world, with a prisoner eating bread. The last 4 verses say that a captive monarch was brought out of prison, that his prison clothes were changed, that he was seated at the king's table above the other captive kings, and that he received a daily ration every day of his life, and that's where it ends. The last line is a food delivery. Nobody writes an ending like that by accident. And practically everything people think they know about this work is wrong from the cover. To begin with, it's not 2 books. It's one split in half for reasons that have nothing to do with Scripture. Second, in the Hebrew Bible, it is not classified as history. It's classified as prophecy. And that classification completely changes how every page should be read. And third, the criterion by which it judges 40 rulers is not economics or social justice or military power. It's a criterion so specific and so repeated that once you detect it, you can't stop seeing it. And it explains why the most powerful monarch of the northern kingdom receives barely 6 verses, while a prophet without a throne takes up entire chapters. This is not a tour through familiar stories. It's the reconstruction of the hidden machinery of a work designed, line by line, to answer that question from chapter 9. The question God himself put in the mouths of those who would pass by the ruins. To understand the magnitude of that sentence, you have to go back 1 chapter, to the day before, when not a single stone was yet out of place. On the surface, everything was splendor, the wisdom, the judgment of the 2 mothers, the visit of the Queen of the South. The descriptions of the sanctuary are the most detailed in all the Bible. Measurements, materials, finishes, cherubim of olive wood overlaid with gold, doors carved with palms and open flowers. And at the exact center of that stretch, there's a chapter that's usually read quickly. And it's probably the most theologically profound moment in the entire book. The dedication prayer. The sanctuary is finished. The ark has been brought in. The account says a cloud filled the house of the Lord so that the priests could not remain to minister, because the glory of the Lord had filled the house. Solomon then stands before the altar, spreads his hands toward heaven and prays. What do you ask God on the day you hand him the most expensive building ever constructed in your country? What that man said resembles nothing you would expect. It's the longest prayer recorded in the entire book, and one of the longest in the Hebrew Bible. It begins by acknowledging the obvious, that there is no God like him in heaven above or on earth below, who keeps his covenant and steadfast love for his servants. And within a few verses, it formulates a question that completely dismantles what he himself has just built. He asks whether God will truly dwell on the earth, and he says that, behold, heaven and the heaven of heavens cannot contain him. How much less this house that he has built? Stop there. The man who has invested 7 years and an incalculable fortune in raising that building, on the day of its dedication before all the assembly of Israel, publicly declares that that building cannot contain God. It's not a critical prophet saying it, not an enemy. It's the builder at the opening ceremony. And what he asks for next is even more precise. He doesn't ask God to live there. He asks that his eyes be open toward this house night and day, toward the place of which he has said his name will be there. He asks that he hear the prayer his servant makes in that place. The distinction is delicate and enormous. The sanctuary is not God's residence. It's the address toward which one prays. It's the point of contact, not the cage. And then Solomon enumerates situations. It's a very long list of scenarios in which the people might need to cry out. When someone sins against his neighbor, when the people are defeated by the enemy, when the sky is shut and there is no rain, when there is famine or pestilence or plague or locusts, when a foreigner who is not of your people comes from a far country because of your name. And he comes to the last scenario on the list, and this is the one to listen to carefully, because it's the one that turns this prayer into the key to the entire work. Solomon sets up the hypothetical that the people might sin against God, for there is no one who does not sin, and that God would be angry with them and give them over to the enemy, so that their captors take them as prisoners to an enemy land, whether far or near. And he asks that if there, in the land where they are taken captive, they take it to heart and repent and pray toward their land, toward the city God has chosen and the house that he built, then God would hear in heaven their prayer and their plea and maintain their cause. Now put the pieces together. The book of Kings ends with the people deported and a king of Judah captive in Babylon, receiving unexpectedly benevolent treatment from his captor. And in chapter 8, 4 centuries before that happened, on the day the temple was dedicated, Solomon prays asking for exactly that. The ending of the book is the answer to the prayer with which the book begins. That is a deliberate literary structure. The author placed in Solomon's mouth, at the moment of maximum splendor, the exact scenario of the disaster he and his readers were already living through. And he placed there also the only available hope, that even from exile one can still pray toward that place, though the place is in ruins. The deportees who read those pages in Babylon knew perfectly well what they were reading. They were reading their own situation, described 4 centuries earlier, with a promise attached. And in the next chapter comes the divine response to that prayer. God accepts the house, puts his name there, and adds a condition. If they or their children turn aside and serve other gods, then the house would be cast out of his presence and become a heap of ruins. There in chapter 9, with the building freshly consecrated and the smell of the sacrifices still in the air, the ending of the book is written. And the question the strangers would ask before the rubble is written there too, along with the answer they would give themselves, because they forsook the Lord their God. Everything that follows is 47 chapters demonstrating that sentence. If this just rearranged the entire book for you, write it in the comments, the question from chapter 9. That's how we know who is really reading. And then comes the part that almost nobody connects, because generations later, a young man from Judah who served in that empire opened the windows of his chamber that faced Jerusalem and knelt 3 times a day and prayed toward the city, toward the house, exactly as Solomon had asked. And that prayer is the reason why the fire, 4 centuries later, didn't destroy the faith of an entire people. When the smoke rose over Jerusalem, something more than a building burned, a certainty burned. For generations, the people of Judah had lived with a simple conviction: God dwelt in that sanctuary. As long as the sanctuary stood, the people would be safe. The sanctuary no longer stood. Chapter 25 of the second book of Kings describes the plunder with the coldness of an inventory. The soldiers tore down the bronze pillars and cut them in pieces to transport them. They took the pots, the shovels, the snuffers, the dishes. The account enumerates object by object, like someone drafting a receipt. And then, almost in passing, it mentions that they set fire to the house of the Lord, to the palace and to all the great houses of the city. The survivors were led in chains toward the east, to a plain of brick and canals where there were no hills, no olive trees, no smell of limestone at midday. And there they began to ask the question. Not the political question. That was easy to answer. Babylon was larger, had more soldiers and better siege machines. Anyone could understand it. The question was different, and it was unbearable. If the God of Israel was the only true God, if he had parted the sea, if he had brought down the walls of Jericho, if he had promised David a throne forever, then the destruction of the sanctuary meant one of two things. Either that God was weak and had lost to the gods of Babylon, or that God had done this deliberately. There is no third option, and the Book of Kings exists precisely to defend the second. The entire work, from beginning to end, is a sustained argument. It's the long documented answer of someone who sat down with royal archives, with palace chronicles, with the memories of prophets, and built a case file to demonstrate that the catastrophe was not a divine defeat. It was a sentence. And to sustain that argument, the author had to make brutal editorial decisions. He had to ignore information that any modern historian would consider fundamental. He had to dedicate disproportionate space to episodes that seem minor. He had to apply the same measuring rod to 40 different men, without exceptions, without nuances, without mercy. And those decisions left traces. Let's start with the most visible one, the one literally in the table of contents of any Bible, and that almost nobody stops to question. The existence of two books where there was always one. The original title in Hebrew is a single word, Melachim, Kings. No number, no part 1, no part 2. A continuous scroll that started with David's old age and ended with that captive's dinner in Babylon. The ancient Jewish scribes counted it as a single unit. In the rabbinic lists of the canon, Melachim appears as one book. The same is true of Samuel. Nobody in the ancient Hebrew world spoke of a first or second anything. The division came from a practical problem. When translating the scriptures into Greek, each word expanded because Hebrew is written without vowels and Greek is not. A scroll that in Hebrew fit in one manageable piece became in Greek something impossible to roll and consult. The solution was to split it in two. That division passed into Latin and from there into Western Bibles. In printed Hebrew, it was introduced much later, in the 16th century, when a Venetian printer copied it so his pages would match the Latin editions, and he added a marginal note indicating that this was where non-Jews began the fourth book of Kings. Read that again. The printer knew he was inserting a foreign division. He labeled it a borrowing. Now someone might say the cut is harmless, that it separates the writing at a logical point. It isn't, and here is the proof. The first book of Kings ends with a monarch named Ahaziah, son of Ahab, ascending to the throne of the north. The second book of Kings begins with that same Ahaziah falling through the lattice of his upper chamber and being seriously injured. It's the same scene. The same man, the same original paragraph. The cut passes through the middle of a story that is halfway through. It's as if someone took a novel and decided that Volume 1 ends when the protagonist steps on the staircase and Volume 2 begins when he falls. No author would do that. And this opens an uncomfortable door, because if the division into two books is artificial, one wonders what else of what we take as natural is in reality an added layer. The numbered chapters and verses didn't exist in antiquity either. They were introduced in the Middle Ages and in the 16th century to facilitate reference. None of that is scripture. All of it is scaffolding. And when you forget that scaffolding is scaffolding, it starts to look like the building. The division into two books, however, is not even the most important thing done to Melachim. The most important was moving it to a different section. The Hebrew Bible is organized in 3 blocks. And that order is not decorative. It's a declaration about what kind of text each thing is. The first block is the Torah, the 5 scrolls of Moses, the law, the foundation, the covenant. The third is called Ketuvim, writings. There go the Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Ruth, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. And between those two stands the second block, Neviim, the prophets. That block divides into 2 halves. The latter prophets are the names anyone would expect: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12. And the former prophets are 4 works that at first glance seem not prophetic at all: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Melachim. There it is. Kings is not catalogued among the writings, alongside Chronicles. It's catalogued among the prophets, alongside Isaiah. And the contrast is devastating because Chronicles covers much of the same material. The same monarchs, the same wars, the same sanctuary, and yet Chronicles ended up in the writings section, while Melachim stayed among the prophets. 2 texts about the same period, on 2 different shelves, because they do different things. Chronicles looks backward from the return from exile and organizes the past to rebuild an identity. Melachim looks backward from inside the disaster and organizes the past to explain a sentence. One rebuilds, the other prosecutes. And here it's worth clarifying something that's often misunderstood. Prophecy, in Hebrew thought, does not primarily mean predicting the future. It means speaking in God's name about the present. The prophet is the one who interprets events in light of the covenant. The one who says, this that you are living through means this. That's why Melachim can be prophecy, even though it narrates past events. It's not predicting what will come. It's declaring what was meant by what already happened. And when you understand that, everything strange about the book suddenly becomes coherent. Why does the account pass over enormous military achievements in 2 sentences? Because a prophet doesn't write victory bulletins. Why does it pause for entire pages on a man who lives in the open air and is fed by ravens? Because for a prophet, that man is the true center of gravity of the era. Why does every ruler receive a moral grade before a single one of his public works is mentioned? Because the genre is not chronicle. The genre is verdict. And there's a detail that confirms that reading and that most readers skip without seeing it. The author cites his sources. Dozens of times, at the end of the account of each ruler, a formula appears referring to another document. For the northern kingdom, to the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. For the south, to the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah. And for the first stretch, even a book of the Acts of Solomon is mentioned. 3 distinct archives, explicitly cited, with the implicit invitation to go and verify. Think about what that means. Someone inventing would not invite anyone to cross-check. Someone fabricating legends would not repeatedly point toward other documents that in his era presumably still existed. The formula functions like a footnote. It says, in effect, here is what matters to me to say about this man. If what you're looking for is his battles and his construction projects, that information is in the other archive. And inside that sentence hides the editorial heart of the entire work. Because the author is acknowledging that 2 possible histories of the same period exist. One is what the official chronicles record: waterworks, military campaigns, treaties, walls. The other is what he decided to write. And he chose the second. Now, by what criterion? Take any Bible, open it to Melachim, and start reading the introductions of each ruler. At first, they look like administrative routine. After 3 or 4, you notice something repeating. After 10, you understand you're reading a form. For the rulers of Judah, the file always includes the same fields. In what year of the northern monarch he began to reign, how old he was when he came to the throne, how many years he governed, what his mother's name was, then the moral evaluation, then the reference to the archive, then the death, the burial place, and the successor's name, always the same order, always the same fields. In that file there is one field that decides everything, the moral evaluation. Each of the 40 men who pass through that book receives a grade, and the grade is issued with a fixed formula. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, or he did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord. Here is the first surprise. In the northern kingdom, from the division until the fall of Samaria, around 20 men governed over 2 centuries. Not one receives a positive grade, not one. All of them, without exception, are failed. And in almost all cases, the failure is expressed with the same formula. He walked in the way of Jeroboam, and in his sin by which he made Israel to sin. And in the south, the matter becomes genuinely interesting. In Judah, some rulers do receive a positive grade. Asa, Jehoshaphat, Joash, Amaziah, Azariah, Jotham. 6 names the book acknowledges did what was right. And to all 6, without failing even once, the same clause is added. Nevertheless, the high places were not taken away. The people still sacrificed and burned incense at the high places, 6 times, identical, like a signature. It's the margin note of an examiner correcting with the same pen generation after generation. Good, but correct, but passing, but. And what exactly were the high places? In Hebrew, bamot. The term has traditionally been translated as high places, and that translation has created a mental image that is probably inaccurate. Most specialists today consider the word refers not primarily to elevation, but designates a cult enclosure, a platform, an altar, a local sanctuary. And here a very widespread assumption needs to be dismantled. Many people assume the Bamot were temples to pagan gods. In some cases they were, but in the majority of cases the work condemns they weren't. They were sanctuaries where the God of Israel was worshipped. Think about the geography. A peasant from the hills of Judah lived 2 or 3 days' journey from Jerusalem. He had animals to tend, crops to look after, young children. Going up to the capital for every offering was, in practice, impossible. For centuries there had been a local sanctuary in his village or on the neighboring hill. His father had offered there, his grandfather had offered there. They offered to the same God, with the same prayers, with the same animals. And the book condemns it. Why? Because the law contained in Deuteronomy establishes a rule that sounds administrative and is in reality theological. The sacrifice must be offered at the place which the Lord your God shall choose to put his name, and nowhere else. That chapter repeats it with an almost hammering insistence. There you shall bring your burnt offerings. There you shall eat before the Lord. Take care that you do not offer your burnt offerings at any place that you see. The underlying reason has logic. A dispersed cult is an uncontrollable cult. Each local sanctuary develops its own customs. Each rural priest improvises, and as the generations pass, the rites of neighboring peoples gradually filter in. First, a sacred post beside the altar, then an upright stone, then a clay figure for the fertility of the fields. Excavations in common houses in Judah have uncovered hundreds of those figurines. Small ceramic statuettes, probably used as amulets by families who considered themselves perfectly faithful. And that is exactly what the book denounces. So the formula repeated 6 times is not a minor detail. It's the author's way of saying that even the best rulers of the South didn't solve the underlying problem. They could repair the sanctuary, win wars, govern well. But as long as worship remained dispersed across hundreds of rural altars, the drift was inevitable. Only 2 men over 4 centuries escape that clause. We'll get to them. There's something to say first, and it dismantles the easy reading of everything above, because the problem of the dispersed sanctuaries didn't start with Jeroboam or with any northern king. It started with the man who prayed that prayer. Solomon occupies the first 11 chapters of the work. He's by far the character given the most continuous space. And the way that stretch is written is a lesson in how an ancient author could destroy someone without ever saying a harsh word. Watch what happens beneath the splendor. In the Law of Moses, in the book of Deuteronomy, there is a passage known as the Law of the King. It's a brief text that establishes what a future monarch of Israel must not do. There are 3 specific prohibitions: not to acquire many horses, nor to cause the people to return to Egypt to get them, not to acquire many wives, so that his heart does not turn away, not to accumulate excessive silver or gold. 3. Only 3. Now open the account of Solomon and look for those 3 things. Chapter 10 reports that he gathered chariots and horsemen in enormous numbers, and that his horses were imported from Egypt. That same chapter reports that the gold that came to him in 1 year weighed 666 talents. And chapter 11 reports that he had 700 royal wives and 300 concubines. The 3 prohibitions, all 3 violated. In the same order they appear in the law. That is not coincidence, it's a structured accusation. The author is placing the monarch's life alongside a legal text and checking the boxes one by one, without raising his voice, letting the reader who knows the law do the mental work. And the blow comes. The account declares that when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and that his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. And then comes the sentence that ties the whole book together. He built high places. The man who built the central sanctuary, who prayed at its dedication, asking that that house be the place where God's name would dwell, that same man built cult enclosures on the hill facing Jerusalem for the deities of his foreign wives. Chemosh, the god of Moab; Molech, that of the Ammonites; Ashtoreth, that of the Sidonians. The founder of centralized worship was also the founder of the sanctuaries the entire book would spend 4 centuries condemning. Now return to the repeated formula. The high places were not taken away. Every time it appears, it points backward, toward that hill. And 300 years later, when a ruler finally destroys them, the passage will specify that he tore down precisely the ones Solomon had built. The author kept that loose thread throughout the whole book and tied it at the end. It's worth saying, in passing, that the architecture described in those chapters is not fantasy. In northern Syria, sanctuaries from the same period have been excavated with the same floor plan the text describes: a vestibule, a main hall, and a smaller elevated inner chamber, with decorations of lions, cherubim, and plant motifs. They don't prove anything about the Jerusalem temple, which has never been excavated. What they show is that the building described corresponds to a real and documented type of construction in that region. And it must also be said with the same honesty that to date, no inscription outside the Bible has appeared mentioning Solomon by name. That doesn't prove he didn't exist, because the written record of that century in the region is generally very sparse. But what has not been confirmed cannot be presented as confirmed. Back to the text, which is where the important things are, because what happens immediately after Solomon's death is the event that splits all subsequent history in 2, and it's a chapter of astonishing political bluntness. The heir was called Rehoboam. And here's a detail that usually gets overlooked. He was not crowned in Jerusalem. He had to travel to Shechem in the northern territory because all Israel had gone there to make him king. In other words, the succession was not automatic. The northern tribes had to accept him, and they summoned him on their own ground. The assembly presented him with a concrete petition. They said his father had made their yoke heavy, and that if he lightened the hard service and the heavy yoke his father had put on them, they would serve him. It's worth understanding what they were talking about, because it wasn't an abstract complaint. The book itself had previously described the system of forced labor by which the temple and the palace were built. Shifts of tens of thousands of men sent to Lebanon, carriers, stonecutters on the mountain, overseers in command. Solomon's greatness had a cost, and the northern workforce paid it. Rehoboam asked for 3 days. What do you do when you inherit a kingdom your father built by squeezing half his subjects? He consulted 2 groups. First, the elders who had stood before his father Solomon while he lived, men with experience of government who had seen up close how a kingdom is sustained. Their advice is rendered with a precision worth hearing in full. They told him that if this day he would be a servant to this people and serve them and speak good words to them, they would be his servants forever. Read it slowly, because it's one of the most remarkable definitions of authority in the Old Testament. The condition for being served always is to serve one day, and Rehoboam rejected that counsel. He went to consult the young men who had grown up with him and stood before him. The expression indicates they were of his generation and his circle, courtiers who owed him their positions, and they literally dictated to him the phrase he should say. That he should tell them his little finger was thicker than his father's loins, that if his father had loaded them with a heavy yoke, he would add to their yoke, that if his father had chastised them with whips, he would chastise them with scorpions. The word scorpions has traditionally been understood as a type of whip with metal tips, though the exact term is debated. The image, in any case, is unambiguous. And on the 3rd day Rehoboam came out and repeated those words to the people, exactly as the young men had dictated them. The passage underscores that he abandoned the counsel of the old men and spoke according to the counsel of the young men. The response of the tribes was immediate and was recorded as a battle cry. They asked what portion they had in David, what inheritance in the son of Jesse. And they said to each other, "To your tents, O Israel, and that David should look after his own house." And they left. Rehoboam, who apparently understood nothing of what had just happened, then committed the second mistake. He sent Adoram. Adoram was in charge of the tribute, the official responsible for the forced labor, the visible face of the system that had just provoked the revolt. All Israel stoned him, and he died. And the account adds a detail that says everything about the state of affairs. Rehoboam himself had to jump into his chariot and flee quickly to Jerusalem. The kingdom split that afternoon and never came back together. Now, there's a line in that chapter that completely changes the reading of the episode, and it usually gets buried beneath the drama. When Rehoboam ignores the elders, the text interrupts the narrative to make a comment. It says that this thing was from the Lord, to fulfill his word that he had spoken by Ahijah the Shilonite. That prophet had announced the division before it happened in the previous chapter, when he tore his new garment into 12 pieces and gave 10 to Jeroboam. So the author is doing 2 things at once, and both must be held without releasing either. On one hand, he narrates a human decision, free, stupid, and perfectly explicable. An insecure heir who prefers to sound tough rather than appear weak, surrounded by friends who tell him what he wants to hear. And on the other hand, he affirms that the outcome was within the announced purpose. That double gaze is the signature of the entire work. The facts have real political causes, and at the same time, they carry meaning within the covenant. The author never chooses one explanation and discards the other. And what Jeroboam did next would become the accusation repeated 20 times across 2 centuries. Jeroboam had a practical problem, and according to the passage, he reasoned about it to himself in his own heart. He said that if that people went up to offer sacrifices at the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, the heart of the people would turn back to their lord Rehoboam, and they would kill him. It's a national security calculation, perfectly rational. If the religious center of your population is in your rival's capital, your population makes pilgrimage 3 times a year to enemy territory. His solution was to make 2 golden calves and set them up in 2 cities, one at the extreme north of his territory and one near the southern border. And notice carefully what he said when presenting them, because the detail is fine. He didn't proclaim them new gods. He said, in essence, that those were the gods who brought the people up out of Egypt. In other words, he wasn't proposing to abandon the God of Israel. He was proposing to worship him in a different way and in a different place. And that distinction is the axis of the entire book. How many times has someone destroyed something sacred, thinking they were only making it more practical? Jeroboam's sin was not primarily atheism or foreign idolatry. It was broken centralization. It was deciding that worship could be practiced wherever was politically convenient. There is also a deliberate echo that any Hebrew reader would catch immediately. The phrase about the gods who brought the people out of Egypt is almost identical to the ones spoken in the desert before the golden calf Aaron melted. The author is saying that the northern kingdom was born by repeating the sin of Sinai, and from that point on, for 200 years, every northern ruler would receive the same verdict. He did not depart from the sin of Jeroboam. Now, if the book were a political chronicle, the next stretch should concentrate on the wars between the two kingdoms, on alliances, on treaties. And that's not what happens. If you measure the space given to each thing, a disproportion appears that cannot be accidental. The central stretch of the work, from the appearance of Elijah to the death of Elisha, occupies roughly a third of the entire text, nearly 20 chapters. 20 chapters devoted to two men who had no throne, no army, no city, no official position. One of them lived in the open air, the other was a plowman before he received the mantle. Meanwhile, the monarch who gave his dynasty the name by which foreign powers identified the entire country receives 6 verses. When a work distributes space that way, it's saying something. It's saying that real history is not written by those who occupy the throne, but by those who carry the message, and the most famous episode of that stretch is usually told in half. Everyone knows the first half, Mount Carmel. The prophets of Baal leaping around the altar from morning until midday, calling out and cutting themselves with swords. Elijah mocking them, suggesting their God might be occupied, or on a journey, or asleep and needed to be woken up. And then the water poured 3 times over the altar, and the fire that falls, and the people prostrating themselves and shouting that the Lord is God. It's the most spectacular scene in the book. And what happens immediately afterward is what almost nobody tells. Jezebel sends a message to Elijah, swearing by her gods that he would be dead by the next day. And the man who just humiliated 450 prophets before an entire nation flees. The text says it without ornament. When he saw the danger, he arose and ran for his life. He walks a full day into the desert, sits down under a juniper tree, and asks to die. He says it is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for he is no better than his fathers. It's one of the most honest descriptions of the collapse after triumph that exists in ancient literature. The public victory didn't sustain him even 24 hours. And what God does next is not a sermon. An angel touches him and tells him to arise and eat. There is a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He eats, drinks, and goes back to sleep. The angel comes a second time, touches him again, and tells him to arise and eat, for the journey is too great for him, food and sleep, twice. Before any theological word, with that strength, he walks 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. And here the author is building a parallel that no Hebrew reader could miss. Horeb is the other name of Sinai. It's the mountain where Moses received the law. 40 days and 40 nights is exactly the time Moses spent there. And when Elijah arrives, he goes into a cave, into a cleft in the rock, which is precisely where Moses was placed when he asked to see the glory of God. Same mountain, same span of time, same crack in the rock. The prophet is being led back to the origin point of the covenant. And there he receives a question. What are you doing here, Elijah? His response is a long, bitter complaint. He says he has been very jealous for the Lord God of hosts, that the people of Israel have forsaken his covenant, thrown down his altars, and killed his prophets with the sword, and that he, even he only, is left, and they seek his life. I alone am left. That is the sentence of an exhausted man who is convinced he has failed. The answer arrives in the form of a scene, not a speech. He is told to go out and stand on the mount before the Lord, and there passes a great and strong wind that splits the mountains and breaks the rocks in pieces. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake. The Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, a fire. The Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, something the Hebrew describes with three very strange words, kol demama daka. It has been translated in many ways: a still small voice, a gentle whisper, a soft murmur. Literally, the words mean something like the sound of a thin silence, or the voice of a delicate stillness. It's an expression almost impossible to render, because it combines sound and silence in the same image. And upon hearing it, Elijah wraps his face in his mantle and goes out to the entrance of the cave. Now think about what just happened. That man had just seen fire fall from heaven before a multitude. His entire experience of God was spectacle, power, public demonstration. And on the mountain of the covenant, he is shown that the wind, the earthquake, and the fire were not the place where God was. It's not that the spectacular is false, it's that it's not where you should look. And when the voice speaks again, it asks him exactly the same question as before. What are you doing here, Elijah? He repeats his complaint, word for word, without changing a comma, and God's response is not comfort, it's instructions. Return by the way you came, anoint these men, and a final correction to his diagnosis. There remain 7,000 in Israel who have not bowed the knee to Baal. I alone am left, he had said. You were 7,000, the text replies. The prophet who thought himself the last of the faithful was wrong by 7,000 people. And there's another episode in that same stretch that summarizes the book's thesis with chilling precision. It's usually told as a simple case of abuse of power, when in reality it's something much more sophisticated and much more disturbing: the vineyard of Naboth. Naboth was a neighbor of Jezreel. He had a vineyard next to Ahab's palace. The monarch wanted it to make a vegetable garden and made him a reasonable offer. I'll give you a better vineyard, or pay its value in money. Naboth said no. And his response is not that of a miser. He says that the Lord forbid that he should give away the inheritance of his fathers. That word inheritance is the key. In Hebrew, nahala. And to understand what was at stake, you have to understand the law of the land in Israel. According to the book of Leviticus, land was not sold in perpetuity, because the land belonged to God, and families were only stewards. Every plot had been assigned to a specific clan in the original distribution, and was to remain in that clan generation after generation. There was even a mechanism of periodic restitution to undo sales forced by poverty. Naboth was not negotiating a price. He was saying he had no authority to sell that, because it was not his in the sense the monarch believed it to be, and Ahab understood. That's why the account describes him going home resentful, lying on his bed, turning his face to the wall, and refusing to eat. It's an almost comical portrait. The most powerful man in the north throwing a child's tantrum because a farmer reminded him of the law. And then his wife enters. Jezebel was the daughter of the ruler of Sidon. She came from a world where the monarch was simply the owner of everything. Her question upon finding him in bed is one of the sharpest sentences in the Old Testament. Do you now govern over Israel? In other words, who's in charge here, you or a peasant? And then she does something that deserves careful examination, because this is where the episode becomes genuinely chilling. She doesn't send soldiers. She doesn't set fire to the vineyard. She doesn't make Naboth disappear in an alley. She writes letters. She writes them in her husband's name, seals them with the royal seal, and sends them to the elders and the nobles of Naboth's city. In those letters, she orders a solemn fast to be called, Naboth to be given a prominent seat before the people, and 2 worthless men placed before him to testify that he has cursed God and the king. Then have him taken out and stone him. Stop at the number, 2 witnesses. Why 2 and not 1? Why not 3 or 10? Because the law of Moses establishes that no one can be condemned on the testimony of a single witness, and that any matter shall be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. Jezebel knew Israelite legislation in detail, and she mounted a procedure that complied with it point by point. Public summons, legitimate assembly, elders of the city as tribunal, accusation of an offense that indeed carried capital punishment, the exact number of witnesses required by the norm, execution in the prescribed form. From the outside, that was not a murder, it was a trial. And that is the horror of the episode, not that power ignored the law, but that it used the law as an instrument. The sacred procedure turned into a killing machine. A solemn fast, an act of humiliation before God, convened expressly to serve as the stage set for a crime. Any lawyer in the kingdom would have certified that everything was in order. And here is where Melachim deploys its complete thesis. Because when Ahab goes down to take possession of the vineyard, he finds a man waiting among the vines, Elijah, without a charge, without an escort, without any legal authority of any kind, standing in the middle of a property that was just acquired through a legally impeccable procedure. And the monarch's greeting reveals everything one needs to know about their relationship. Have you found me, O my enemy? That is the balance of forces the work wants us to see. On one side, the throne, the army, the courts, the witnesses, the royal seal. On the other, a man alone saying that was wrong. And the passage has no doubt about which of the 2 represents the real power. Now, there's a twist in this story that most people don't know, and that complicates the portrait of Ahab in a way the author himself did not want to hide. After hearing the verdict, Ahab tears his clothes, puts on sackcloth, fasts, lies in sackcloth, and goes about meekly. And the account says God took note of that. The sentence is not cancelled, but is deferred. It will not fall on him, but on his house after his days. Think about what it means that the author included that detail. He could have omitted it perfectly. It would have suited him to leave the villain as a pure villain. Instead, he recorded that the man he has just described as the worst ruler yet humbled himself, and that his humbling had effect. A propagandist doesn't write that. A propagandist doesn't grant the enemy a moment of conscience. And now the sentence must be closed, because the account closes it. 3 years after the vineyard incident, Ahab wanted to recover a city in Gilead and persuaded the Judean monarch to go with him. Before setting out, they consulted the court prophets. 400 men answered in chorus that he should go up, that God would deliver the place into his hand. The Judean asked for a second opinion. He asked whether there wasn't another prophet of the Lord, and Ahab's response portraits him completely. He said there was one more, but he hated him because he never prophesied good about him, but evil. That man was called Micaiah. And when they finally brought him before the 2 thrones, after a messenger had suggested on the way that he speak as the others did, he said the opposite of all of them. He said he had seen all Israel scattered on the mountains, like sheep that have no shepherd. He was sent to prison on bread and water until the king returned. And Ahab, who had obviously listened, did something revealing. He disguised himself. He went into battle without his royal insignia, while the Judean entered with his. It's the maneuver of a man who doesn't believe the oracle but doesn't dare ignore it either. And the account records the outcome with a devastating coldness. A soldier drew his bow at random, aiming at no one, and the arrow entered between the scale armor, without aim, without plan, without a name. They propped him up in the chariot until evening, and the blood from the wound flowed down into the bottom of the vehicle. At sunset, he died. They brought the chariot to wash at the pool of Samaria, and the dogs licked his blood. According to the word that had been spoken among the vines of a vegetable garden, the vineyard collected, and the man who had issued that verdict didn't end the way you'd expect either. Elijah doesn't die in the account. The chapter tells it with astonishing economy. He was walking with Elisha, talking, and there appeared a chariot of fire with horses of fire which separated the two. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. Elisha saw him go and cried out a sentence that must be heard slowly, because it's the thesis of the entire book compressed into 7 words. My father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. Stop there. He just called a man alone, without an army, without horses, without a single weapon, the cavalry of the nation. In a world where military power was measured in chariots, and where the archives of empires counted Israel's chariots by the thousands, the disciple looks at the empty sky and says that the armed force of the country has just gone up in that whirlwind. Then he picks up the mantle that fell and tears his own clothes in two. And in case any doubt remained about where the account is pointing, that same sentence reappears at the end of the cycle. When Elisha is dying, the king of Israel comes down to visit him, weeps over his face, and says exactly the same thing. My father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. The king, with his army intact, tells a dying man that he was the real army. And the chapter closes with a scene that seems taken from another genre. Shortly after burying Elisha, some men were burying another man when they saw a raiding party coming. In their haste, they threw the body into Elisha's tomb, and when the man touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood on his feet. Even in death, the word that man had carried kept operating. And here ends the first half of this story. Everything you've seen until now happened inside the text. Kings judging, prophets speaking, dynasties falling. What comes now is different, because 3 of these men left traces outside the Bible, written by their own enemies, and one of them has a face. After that, the second half collapses toward the fire, and there's a chapter where God's entire promise is locked in a room with a baby. And at this point it's worth pausing briefly, because this man and his father are the point where the biblical account intersects with documents written by their enemies. There exists an Assyrian stele, found in what is now southeastern Turkey, that lists the kings who faced the imperial army in a battle fought in the year 853 BC. And on that list appears, by proper name, Ahab the Israelite, with 2,000 chariots and 10,000 soldiers. Honesty is called for here. The figure for chariots is extraordinarily high, and many researchers consider it inflated, since exaggerating the enemy's strength was standard practice in imperial propaganda. What nobody disputes is the existence of the man. There also exists a basalt stela found in what is now Jordan, today in the Louvre Museum, written in the first person by Meshach, king of Moab. In it he mentions Omri, king of Israel, and tells that monarch oppressed Moab for many years and that his god Chemosh finally delivered him. Chapter 3 of the second half of Melachim tells that same rebellion from the other side. And here is what makes that stone unique. The theological structure of the 2 versions is identical. Meshach explains his previous defeat by saying his God was angry with his people and his victory by recovered favor. The biblical book explains the defeats of Israel in exactly the same way. That means something usually overlooked. The way Melachim writes is not a late peculiarity. It's the standard mode in which history was narrated in that world, where events were always told accompanied by their divine meaning. There is a third piece, a dark stone obelisk from what is now Iraq. where an inscription records the tribute of Jehu, and a relief shows a man prostrate touching the ground with his forehead before the Assyrian sovereign. Several specialists point out that if this figure is the monarch himself and not an ambassador, it would be the only known image of a king of Israel made during his lifetime. And there's an irony in that inscription worth noting because it connects to the biblical text. The Assyrians call Jehu son of Omri. But Jehu was not Omri's son. The book is explicit. He was the son of Jehoshaphat, son of Nimshi. And not only did he not belong to that family, he came to power by exterminating it. The account itself says he had 70 descendants of Ahab decapitated and the heads piled up in 2 mounds at the city gate. And before that, he had passed through Jezreel. Jezebel knew he was coming, and what she did is one of the strangest scenes in the book. She put eye paint on her eyes, arranged her hair, and looked out of the window. She didn't flee. She put on her queen's face and waited at the top, looking down, as she had always looked. When Jehu entered the gate, she received him with a political insult, calling him a murderer of his lord. He didn't even answer her. He raised his face toward the window and asked who was on his side. 2 or 3 officers leaned out, and he gave a single order: throw her down. They threw her down. Her blood spattered the wall and the horses, and the chariot ran over her. Then Jehu went in to eat and drink, and only then ordered that she be buried, because she was a king's daughter. There was almost nothing left to bury, and the one who had announced that end years earlier was the same man who had stood up to her amid the vines of Naboth. For the imperial archives, however, Israel continued to be called the House of Omri for generations. It was the name of the country, not a surname. The man who physically erased a dynasty continued to be identified by the world with the name of that dynasty. And with that, we return to the text, because what happened after that massacre is the moment when all the promise made to David nearly ended in a locked room. What happens when God's promise depends on a baby not crying? And before seeing what happened in the south, it's worth stopping at a chapter in that same stretch that shows the book's thesis from the opposite angle. Because until now, the pattern has always been the same. The powerful don't listen, and the prophet speaks alone. There's a chapter where that is completely reversed. Naaman was a commander of the Syrian army. The text presents him with an accumulation of praises, a great man with his master in high favor, a mighty man of valor. And then, with a single word, it knocks everything down. He was a leper. Now notice who sets the story in motion. Not a seer, not a king, not a priest, a little girl. The account says the Syrians had gone out in bands and had taken captive a young girl from the land of Israel, and that she served Naaman's wife. In other words, a kidnapped girl, torn from her home by that man's soldiers, enslaved in the home of the man whose army destroyed her life. And that girl is the one who opens her mouth. She tells her mistress that if only her lord would go before the prophet in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy. Stop at the moral magnitude of that sentence. The victim shows her captor the road to healing. And the mechanism of empire sets in motion. The general tells his king, the king of Syria writes a letter to the king of Israel, and Naaman presents himself with horses, chariots, 10 talents of silver, 6,000 pieces of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. It's a high-level diplomatic delegation bringing a fortune, and the reaction of the king of Israel is one of the most revealing scenes in the book. He tears his clothes and shouts, asking whether he is God, to kill and to make alive, that this man sends to him to cure a man of his leprosy. And he concludes that this is a pretext to pick a fight with him. The king of the people of God, with the most important man of God of his generation, living a few miles away, doesn't remember he exists. A foreign slave girl knew where the prophet was. The king of Israel did not. The man of God hears of it and sends a message that sounds almost like a rebuke. Let him come to me, and he will know there is a prophet in Israel." And then comes the part everyone loves, and that's almost always told wrong. Naaman presents himself with all his retinue at the door of the house, and the prophet doesn't come out. He sends a message with a servant, "Go and wash 7 times in the Jordan." Naaman is furious, and the text records his complaint with an honesty that makes it immediately recognizable. He said he had told himself that the prophet would come out, would stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and wave his hand over the place and cure the leprosy. In other words, he had scripted the scene. He knew exactly how the miracle should happen. And his second complaint is even more human. He asks whether the rivers of Damascus are not better than all the waters of Israel, and whether he could not wash in them and be clean. The Jordan is not an impressive river, it's narrow and muddy. That man had brought a fortune, an escort, and a royal letter, and they were asking him to wade in a dirty stream 7 times with nobody watching, and he turned away in anger. The one who stops him, again, is not a king or a prophet. It's his servants. They approach him and reason with him with simple logic, that if the prophet had commanded him something great, he would have done it. How much more when he only said, "Wash and be clean." And he went down and dipped himself 7 times according to the word of the man of God. And the passage adds a detail of disconcerting tenderness. His flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child. The hardened general recovers a newborn skin. Then he returns, stands before the prophet, and makes a declaration extraordinary in the mouth of a Syrian commander, that he now knows there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. And he asks something strange. He asked to take 2 mule loads of earth with him. He wanted soil from Israel to take back to Damascus. In the thinking of that era, gods were bound to territories, and he was trying to take a piece of the territory to worship there. It's theologically clumsy, and Elisha doesn't correct him. He simply says, "Go in peace." There is a patience there that the book rarely grants to its own. And the chapter doesn't end at the healing, but with a brutal contrast. Gehazi, the prophet's servant, runs after the departing delegation, and by deceit obtains part of the silver and the garments that Naaman had offered, and his master had declined. The outsider leaves clean. The Israelite who lived alongside the prophet is left with the disease. The outsider recognizes God. The insider keeps the money. And that is exactly the argument the book has been sustaining from the beginning, told this time in a single scene. And now there's a detail from that same form that we left pending, and it reveals how that court functioned. The mother's name. In the files of the southern kingdom, the maternal name appears with a regularity that cannot be accidental. Abijah, daughter of Zechariah; Jecoliah of Jerusalem; Jerusha, daughter of Zadok; Hamutal, a daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. A long list of women whose only record is that one line. Why did the mother matter so much? Because in that monarchy there existed a real, not symbolic office. In Hebrew called Gevirah, the Great Lady. The mother of the monarch occupied an institutional position at court, with influence over succession and the royal council. In a society where the ruler had multiple wives, the one who bore the heir acquired a power no other had. There's a scene that demonstrates it. When Solomon is already reigning, his mother Bathsheba enters the throne room. And the account describes the monarch himself rising, bowing to her, and ordering that a seat be placed for her at his right. The most powerful man in the kingdom stands to greet his mother and gives her the place of honor. And there's a negative proof, even more eloquent. The text records that one of those women was deposed from her position because she had made an abominable image for the worship of Asherah. Deposed. The word implies dismissal from a formal post. You don't depose someone from a feeling. You depose someone from an office. Keep that office in mind, because one of those women nearly wiped the house of David from the earth. That massacre had a consequence in the south that the book tells in a single chapter, and that concentrates the greatest tension in the entire account. The Judean monarch had married into the house of Ahab, and that matrimonial alliance brought to Jerusalem a woman named Athaliah. When Jehu exterminated the northern royal family, he also killed the ruler of Judah, who was there on a visit. And Athaliah, seeing that her son was dead, did something that has no precedent in all of biblical history. The passage says it in 6 words. She arose and destroyed all the royal offspring, all her own grandchildren, the children of the son who had just died, the rightful heirs to David's throne. And she herself sat down to rule. Stop to consider the magnitude of what the book is claiming. The entire work rests on a promise made to David, that he would never lack a descendant on the throne. The book calls it, with a beautiful image, a lamp before God in Jerusalem. And in that chapter, the promise is reduced to 0. There is no heir. There is no lineage. The dynasty of David has been physically eliminated, and on the throne of Jerusalem sits the daughter of the house of Ahab. 6 years. For 6 years, according to the account, the south was governed by someone who was not of the Davidic line, and who got there by killing the Davidic line, and all that remained of God's promise fit in one woman's arms. Her name was Jehosheba. She was the sister of the murdered king. The text also presents her in the parallel passage of another book as the wife of the priest Jehoiada. In the middle of the massacre, she took Joash, one of the king's sons, and hid him away from among the king's sons who were being killed, him and his nurse, in the bedroom. And so she hid him from Athaliah. Think about the scene. A woman entering a room where children are being executed, taking one, and walking out with him and his nurse without anyone noticing. The child was around 1 year old because he was 7 when they crowned him, and 6 he spent in hiding. And he was hidden with her in the house of the Lord for 6 years. There is the finest irony of the entire episode. Athaliah had established in Jerusalem the cult of Baal. The temple of the God of Israel was, during her reign, a building in decline and probably under surveillance, and the heir to the throne grew up inside that building. The only place she didn't look was the house of that God, whose promise she thought she had cancelled. Share this video with someone who thinks they already know all the stories of the Bible. Nobody told this one the way it is. In the 7th year, the priest Jehoiada organized the operation, and the account describes it with a level of military detail that appears in almost no other passage in the book. He summoned the captains of the hundreds and the guards, brought them into the sanctuary, made a covenant with them, and showed them the king's son. Then he gave them precise deployment instructions. He distributed the shifts, assigned positions at the entrance beside the altar around the building, and ordered that the boy be surrounded with weapons in hand, and that whoever came within the ranks be put to death. And he gave them the spears and the shields that had belonged to King David and were kept in the house of the Lord. It's a detail of enormous symbolic weight. The weapons of the dynasty's founder, taken from storage, placed in the hands of the men who will restore his descendant. Then they brought out the boy, put the crown on him, handed him the testimony, anointed him, and proclaimed him king. And the people clapped their hands and shouted, "Long live the king!" Athaliah heard the noise from the palace and went to see what was happening. And the scene she finds is described with notable visual precision. The text says, "The king was standing by the pillar according to custom, with the captains and the trumpeters beside him, and all the people of the land rejoicing and blowing the trumpets. She tore her clothes and cried a single word, treason. That word is the last thing recorded from her mouth. The priest ordered her taken outside the enclosure, so she would not die within the house of the Lord. They brought her by the way by which the horses enter, and there put her to death. And then Jehoiada did 3 things, in this order, and the order matters more than the things. What would you do first? Seat the child on the throne or tear down the altars. First, a covenant between the Lord, the king, and the people, that they would be the Lord's people. Second, the demolition of the temple of Baal, its altars and its images. And only then did he seat the child on the throne of the kings. The covenant first, the throne afterward. Now connect that chapter with the ending of the book. Melachim ends with a descendant of David captive in Babylon, without a kingdom, without an army, without a city, of whom it is expressly reported that he is alive and has children. And in the middle of the book, there is a chapter where that same lineage was reduced to a single baby, hidden in a closet for 6 years. Twice the promise hung by a thread. Twice the thread held. That is the pattern the author is building. He doesn't promise greatness. He promises continuity, and promises it in its most fragile form possible, a hidden child, a prisoner eating bread. And here, something should be said about Joash, because the work doesn't idealize him. That boy reigned 40 years and receives a positive note while the priest who saved him was alive. He repaired the house of the Lord with a collection system the text describes with administrative detail. A chest with a hole in the top beside the altar where the priests at the door put all the money brought to the sanctuary. And to his file is added the usual clause. The high places were not taken away. Not even the baby hidden in the temple escaped it. The northern kingdom fell in the year 722 BC. The biblical account says the king of Assyria came up against Samaria and besieged it for 3 years, and that in the 9th year of the last Israelite ruler, the city was taken and its population deported to Assyria. And then the work does something it does at no other moment in its 47 chapters. It stops. It stops narrating. It suspends the chronology. And it devotes an entire chapter to explaining why what just happened. It's chapter 17 of the second book of Kings, and it is, in practice, the only explicit sermon in the entire work. The author enumerates. He says the people of Israel did secretly against the Lord their God things that were not right, that they built high places in all their cities, from watchtower to fortified city, that they set up pillars and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every green tree, that they served idols, that they made their sons and daughters pass through fire, that they practiced divination and omens. And he adds the data that frames everything, that the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, telling them to turn from their evil ways. Notice that sentence, because it holds the reading key of the entire work. Through every prophet, the author has just said that those 20 chapters devoted to men without thrones were not a digression. They were the warning. For 2 centuries, there was someone who said what needed to be said, and nobody listened. And notice the sophistication of the argument. The author doesn't deny the military facts. He doesn't say the empire was weak. He fully acknowledges its power. What he does is reinterpret the causality. The empire was the instrument, not the cause. The cause was internal and had been operating in silence for 200 years, one rural sanctuary at a time. That is exactly the answer the deportees of Judah would desperately need a century and a half later. That's why Melachim is prophecy and not chronicle, because its function is not to inform. It's to interpret a catastrophe so that a people can survive it without losing their faith. And in that same chapter, there's a detail that had consequences for the following 800 years. The passage tells that the conqueror brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Avva, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and settled them in the cities of Samaria in place of the deported Israelites. That newly arrived population brought their own gods. And according to the account, people began to die attacked by lions, which was interpreted as their not knowing how to honor the God of that land. A priest from Israel was then sent to teach them. The result was a religious mixture that the passage describes with a precise and devastating sentence. They feared the Lord and served their own gods. There, in that line, is born one of the longest identity conflicts in biblical history, because the descendants of that mixed population are the Samaritans. And 8 centuries later, in a gospel, a woman beside a well will tell a Galilean teacher that her fathers worshipped on that mountain, while the Jews say that the place where people ought to worship is in Jerusalem. That conversation, usually read as a simple difference of opinion, is the last ripple of an 8th century BC deportation policy. The contempt toward Samaritans, the scandal of a Samaritan being the hero of a parable, the woman's surprise that someone from Judea would speak to her, all of it starts in that chapter of the sermon, and there's something more in that fall that dismantles a too comfortable reading. The northern kingdom didn't fall because it was poor, weak, or backward. It fell at the moment of its most recent prosperity. The book itself mentions, almost in passing, that Ahab built an ivory house, and the prophet Amos, who preached in the north just decades before the end, denounces those who lie on beds of ivory and stretch themselves out on their couches, eat lambs from the flock, drink wine in bowls, and anoint themselves with the finest oils. The excavations of Samaria uncovered hundreds of fragments of carved ivory from luxury furniture. The furniture that prophet denounced appeared in the ground. And that is the point. The wealth saved nobody. The chariots that impressed the Assyrians saved nobody. Judah, meanwhile, was still standing, and in the south that fall was read in 2 opposite ways. Some read it as a warning, others read it as proof that it wouldn't happen to them. And in Judah, while the north was collapsing, there governed a man called Ahaz. His chapter is almost never preached, and it's the most literal case of adulterated worship in the entire book. Pressured by a hostile coalition, Ahaz sought help from the empire. He took the silver and gold that were in the house of the Lord and in the palace treasuries, and sent them as a gift to the Assyrian monarch, declaring himself his servant and son. And then went up to Damascus to meet his new lord. There he saw an altar. The account describes what he did next with the precision of a case file. He sent the priest Uriah a detailed sketch of the altar and its model, according to all its workmanship. And Uriah built it, exactly as he had been commanded before the king returned. Think about what that sequence means. A king of Judah travels abroad, sees a cult object he likes, sends the blueprints by messenger, and the high priest has it built before he comes back. And when he returned, he offered on it. Then he moved the bronze altar that had been before the Lord, the one that had been in its place for generations, and pushed it to the north side to make room for the new one in the center. There is the entire image. He destroyed nothing. He banned nothing. He proclaimed no other God. He only moved the old altar a few meters to the side and put the imported one in the center. And he gave an instruction to the priest about the old one, that it would remain for consulting. The altar of the covenant demoted to a piece of consultation furniture. That is exactly what the entire book has been denouncing since chapter 12 of the first scroll. Not the frontal substitution, but the displacement. Nobody denies God. They just move him a little to the side to make room for what works better politically. And the son of that man was the one who took away the high places. The man governing Judah shortly after was called Hezekiah, and his file breaks the mold in a way that can only be appreciated if you've read the 39 before it. After the usual formula, the text declares that he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that David, his father, had done. And then, instead of the clause repeated 6 times throughout the book, the opposite appears. He removed the high places. For the first time in more than 2 centuries, the margin note disappears, and the text continues enumerating. He broke the pillars, cut down the Asherah pole, and broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made. Stop at that last sentence, because it contains one of the most uncomfortable and least commented stories in the Old Testament. The bronze serpent came from the book of Numbers. During the desert journey, the people complained. Venomous snakes appeared, And God commanded Moses to make a bronze serpent and put it on a pole. Whoever was bitten and looked at it would live. That object had been made by explicit divine command. It had been the instrument of a miracle. It had been made with his own hands by the man who spoke with God face to face. And 8 centuries later, it still existed, preserved in Jerusalem. The text explains, with a brevity that cuts, what had happened to it. The people of Israel had made offerings to it until those days. The relic had become an altar, an object that existed to point toward God had become the final destination of devotion. People no longer looked through it. They looked at it, and Hezekiah destroyed it. The text adds that he called it Nehushtan, a Hebrew wordplay that sounds like both bronze and serpent, and which in that context means something like piece of metal. That was the gesture, giving a sacred relic the name of scrap. Think about what that cost. That object was 800 years old and had an impeccable authorship. There were families who had been making pilgrimage to see it for generations. Destroying it must have seemed to many people an act of brutal impiety. And the book records it as one of the acts that make that man the best ruler Judah had had. If you've made it this far, subscribe and turn on the bell, because what comes now is the point where this account intersects with documents written by its own enemies. The lesson is uncomfortable and remains so. An object can have been given by God and still become an obstacle. The antiquity of a practice doesn't sanctify it. And the hardest things to destroy are not foreign idols. They are your own sacred memories. And that man was not only a religious reformer. The book mentions in 2 lines at the end of his account that he made a pool and a conduit and brought water into the city. How do you defend a city whose only water is outside its walls? Those 2 lines describe a work that still exists. Jerusalem had a structural problem. Its only permanent water source was outside the walls. In time of siege, that was a death sentence. The solution was to cut through rock and dig a tunnel of more than 500 meters from the spring to a pool inside the defended perimeter. It was excavated from both ends at once, and the 2 teams met in the darkness. We know this because on the tunnel wall appeared a very ancient Hebrew inscription that tells the story. And what's remarkable about that inscription is who it speaks of. It doesn't mention the monarch. There's no royal dedication, no praise. It speaks of the workers. It tells that while the diggers were lifting the pickaxe, each man toward his companion, the voice of a man calling to another was heard through the stone, and that on the day of the breakthrough they struck pick against pick, and the water flowed to the pool. Those people were so proud of what they had done that they stopped to engrave it before leaving, and the army came. Chapter 18 narrates that the empire came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. Then it narrates the negotiation at the foot of the city wall. And that negotiation deserves to be read carefully because it's a masterpiece of psychological warfare. How do you convince a city to surrender without firing a single arrow? The official sent by the empire plants himself before the wall and speaks in Hebrew, out loud, deliberately, so that the people on the wall understand him. Judah's officials ask him to speak in Aramaic, the diplomatic language, and not to speak in the people's language in the hearing of everyone. He refuses and raises his voice even higher. His speech attacks point by point. He asks in whom they trust. He mocks the alliance with Egypt, calling it a staff of bruised reed that pierces the hand of anyone who leans on it. And then he launches the most dangerous argument of all. He tells them that if they say they trust in their God, then let them remember that it was Hezekiah who took away the high places and the altars, and said that they must worship only before one altar in Jerusalem. Read it again. The enemy is using the religious reform against the reformer. He's telling the people that their king dismantled the sanctuaries where they had always prayed, and that therefore that God is not going to defend them. It's exactly the argument that many in Judah must have been thinking quietly, and he ends with a list of cities and gods that couldn't save anyone, asking why theirs should be any different. And the account records that the people were silent and did not answer him a word, for the king had commanded thus. Then comes Hezekiah's prayer in the sanctuary, the oracle of Isaiah, and the withdrawal of the invading army. Now, about that campaign, there also exists the version from the other side, and comparing them is an exercise worth doing slowly. The annals of the Assyrian monarch, preserved on clay prisms, claim that he besieged and conquered 46 walled cities of Judah, that he took more than 200,000 people from there, and that he shut up the king of Judah inside Jerusalem, his royal city, like a bird in a cage. And now pay attention to what that document does not say. It doesn't say he took Jerusalem. That silence is deafening, because the Assyrian royal inscriptions are the most aggressive propaganda imaginable. They detail captures, burnings, deportations. A monarch who took a capital proclaimed it in full detail. In fact, that same monarch devoted an entire room of his palace to sculpted reliefs representing the siege and capture of another city of Judah, a secondary town. If he had taken the capital with its palace and its sanctuary, the gallery would not have been for the secondary city. And it's worth pointing out that the biblical passage doesn't gloss over anything either. It openly acknowledges that Hezekiah paid tribute and details that he even stripped the gold from the doors of the sanctuary to gather the amount. A text wanting to glorify its protagonist would not include that he stripped the gold cladding from the temple to buy the enemy's withdrawal. The two sources agree on the essentials. There was a campaign, there was devastation, there was a siege, there was tribute, and they diverge on the explanation of the outcome. The book attributes it to divine intervention, and the Assyrian simply doesn't explain why he left. And now comes the turn, because the book doesn't let this character end as a pure hero. After the liberation, the text narrates two more episodes. In the first, Hezekiah falls fatally ill, prays, and receives 15 more years of life. In the second, an embassy arrives in Jerusalem from Babylon, then a lesser power seeking allies against the common enemy. And the ruler of Judah shows them everything. The passage says it with an almost obsessive repetitiveness. He showed them his treasury house, the silver, the gold, the spices, the precious oil, his armory, and all that was found in his storehouses. There was nothing in his house or in all his realm that Hezekiah did not show them. Isaiah presents himself to him and asks what those men have seen. And he announces that the day will come when everything in his house will be carried to Babylon, and that from his own descendants some will be taken to serve in the palace of the king of Babylon. Hezekiah's response is one of the coldest sentences in the Old Testament. He says that the word of the Lord that he has spoken is good, and the account adds his reasoning, for he thought at least there will be peace and security in his days. In his days. The best ruler Judah had had until then hears that his nation will be deported, and his recorded reaction is relief that it won't fall on him. That is the kind of detail that propaganda text would never include. And it's also the hinge of the entire book. Babylon had been mentioned before, in passing, as one of the places from which settlers had come to the north. Here it appears for the first time as a destination and with the sound of a verdict. A century and a half still remains before it happens. But from that moment, the reader knows where everything is headed. The son of that reformer was called Manasseh. He was 12 years old when he came to the throne and governed 55 years. 55 years. It's the longest reign recorded in all the history of Judah, more than double his father's, and he receives the worst grade in the book. The text enumerates what he did with an accumulation that seems deliberately suffocating. He rebuilt the high places his father had destroyed. He erected altars to Baal. He made an Asherah pole. He worshipped all the host of heaven. He built altars inside the temple enclosure itself, in both courts. He made his son pass through fire. He practiced divination and omens, and instituted mediums and necromancers. And he placed a carved image of Asherah inside the house of which God had said he would put his name there. Then the text adds a line that completely changes register. It says he shed very much innocent blood until he had filled Jerusalem from one end to another. That sentence doesn't describe idolatry. It describes repression, and a contextual detail that partly explains it is usually overlooked. That man governed during the apex of the Assyrian Empire. His father had rebelled, and the result had been the devastation of the country. He took the opposite path, total submission. His reign was very long and probably stable. Collaboration worked, and the work condemns him precisely for that. Now notice what the author does with this character, because it's the most audacious structural decision in the entire work. Decades later, when everything has already passed, when the best ruler in Judah's history has carried out the most thorough reform ever attempted, the passage will say that even so, the Lord did not turn from the burning of his great wrath because of all the provocations with which Manasseh had provoked him. In other words, the sentence was signed during those 55 years. Everything that comes afterward happens under a verdict already handed down. And here is the most difficult theological knot in the entire book, the one no preacher resolves comfortably. Because the man who comes next is described as the most faithful of all. His name was Josiah. He was 8 years old when they put him on the throne, after his father was assassinated by his own officials. 8 years old. In the 18th year of his reign, he ordered repair work on the temple. It's an administrative matter. Money is handed over to those in charge. Carpenters, masons, and stonecutters are hired. Timber and dressed stone are bought. And in the middle of that maintenance work, there occurs what is probably the most important literary event in all the Old Testament. The high priest Hilkiah tells the scribe he has found the book of the law in the house of the Lord, a scroll found during renovations. The scribe brings it before the king and reads it to him out loud, and the reaction is immediate. Josiah tears his garments. That gesture implies something enormous. It means that what he just heard, he did not know. It means that the contents of that scroll were, for the ruler of Judah and for the high priest of the temple, material unknown or at least long forgotten. What exactly that scroll was has been debated for more than 2 centuries. The most widespread hypothesis is that it was some form of the Book of Deuteronomy, or a substantial part of it. The argument is one of thematic coincidence. Deuteronomy insists on the centralization of worship in one place, commands the elimination of local sanctuaries, contains a list of curses for the case of covenant breach, and mandates celebrating Passover in a specific way. All of that is exactly what Josiah did next. There are different positions. Some hold that the scroll was genuinely ancient and had fallen into oblivion during the previous 55 years, which is perfectly plausible if the temple was occupied by other cults. Others propose it was composed or reworked at that time. The discussion remains open. What is clear is what the king did afterward, and there a detail appears that is rarely mentioned and is extraordinary. Before acting, he wanted to verify. He sent a delegation of 5 people, headed by the high priest, to inquire of the Lord about the words of that scroll. Now, who did they consult? At that moment in Jerusalem, Jeremiah was preaching, as was Zephaniah, 2 prophets whose books form part of the canon, and the royal delegation went to see neither of them. They went to see a woman. Her name was Huldah. The text presents her as a prophetess, wife of Shallum, son of Tikvah, son of Harhas, keeper of the wardrobe, and it specifies she lived in the 2nd quarter of Jerusalem, a district of the city. 5 senior officials of the kingdom, including the high priest, walked to a city district to ask a woman to authenticate a sacred document, and she responded with absolute authority. The passage puts in her mouth the classical prophetic formula, "Thus says the Lord." She confirmed that the curses of the scroll would fall on that place, and she added a personal message for the king, that because his heart was tender and he humbled himself, his eyes would not see the evil that would come. No hesitation, no consulting anyone, no asking permission. That scene is one of the most remarkable moments in all the Old Testament regarding female authority. The validation of the text that would become the heart of Judah's religious reform passed through Huldah's verdict, and with that verdict in hand, Josiah did what nobody had done. But before demolishing anything, he did something different. He summoned all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem, went up to the house of the Lord with all the men of Judah, the inhabitants of the city, the priests and the prophets, and all the people from the least to the greatest, and he read aloud, before all of them, all the words of the scroll that had been found. Then he stood by the pillar and made a covenant before the Lord. It's the same order that appears in the chapter about Athaliah. The covenant first, then action. First the public reading, then the demolition. And then the demolition came. Chapter 23 is a list of teardowns. He brought out of the sanctuary all the vessels made for Baal, for Asherah, and for all the host of heaven, and burned them outside the city. He tore down the chambers that were inside the enclosure. He defiled the place in the valley where children had been passed through fire. He removed the horses that had been dedicated to the sun at the entrance of the temple, and burned the chariots of the sun. And he came to the hill facing Jerusalem. The text is explicit. He defiled the high places that Solomon had built for the goddess of the Sidonians, for Chemosh of Moab, and for Milcom of the Ammonites. 300 years later, the loose thread the author had left in chapter 11 of the first book was at last tied up. And then the king crossed the border. He went to Bethel, in the territory of the old northern kingdom, and destroyed the altar Jeroboam had built. He ground the stones to dust, the founding sin of the north and the founding sin of the south, erased by the same man in the same campaign. Then he celebrated a Passover according to what was written in that scroll, and the text states that no Passover like it had been kept since the days of the judges. And now the moment arrives when the work breaks, because after all that, after the text declares that before him there was no king who turned to the Lord with all his heart according to all the law of Moses, nor did any arise after him, the following happens. Josiah goes out to meet Pharaoh at Megiddo, and he dies there, at 39 years old. His servants carry the body in a chariot from Megiddo to Jerusalem. The best of all dies young in a battle that probably wasn't his to fight, and in 13 years everything he built comes apart. The work doesn't explain that. It doesn't soften it. It offers no comfort. It simply records it and continues. And that refusal to resolve the tension is, perhaps, the strongest signal that we are not before propaganda. A text fabricated to console would have invented a different ending for that man. What happens next is an accelerated collapse. 4 rulers in 23 years. The first lasts 3 months before Egypt deposes and deports him. The second is a vassal installed by Pharaoh, who changes masters when Babylon defeats Egypt and then rebels. The third is a boy of 18 who reigns 3 months. The fourth is his uncle, placed by Babylon, who also ends up rebelling. The 18-year-old was called Jehoiachin. Remember him, because the book will return to him. His deportation is told in chapter 24. They took the treasures of the sanctuary and of the palace, cut in pieces the gold objects Solomon had made, and deported the elite. The text gives the figure of 10,000 and details that it included the officers, the mighty men of valor, and all the craftsmen and smiths. Notice who was taken. those who knew how to make weapons. The emptying was not only humiliation, it was industrial disarmament, and the king Babylon left on the throne, the uncle of the deported man, held out 11 years before rebelling as well. Then came the final siege. From those months there survive, outside the Bible, some pottery fragments found at the gate of a fortified city in Judah. They were military dispatches written in ink, correspondence between an officer stationed at an outpost and his superior. In one of them, the officer reports that they are watching the fire signals from their post, as ordered, because they can no longer see those from the neighboring city. The communication system of that era worked with bonfires lit on the heights. As long as the fire burned, the position still stood. And fairness is called for. Some specialists hold that the sentence only means the other city was not visible from that point for geographical reasons. Others read it as it appears. What gives force to the second reading is a verse from the book of Jeremiah. Describing exactly that moment, it says the army of the king of Babylon was fighting against Jerusalem and against all the cities of Judah that were left, against Lachish and Azekah, for these alone remained of the fortified cities of Judah, only those two, and the officer writes that he can no longer see the fire from one of them. Those pottery shards are, in practice, the last words written by the kingdom, work letters from one official to another, written by people who did not know they were writing the epilogue of their nation. Then came what chapter 25 describes. The siege lasted around a year and a half. Famine arrived. A breach was made in the wall. The king tried to flee at night by way of the king's garden, was overtaken in the plains of Jericho, and brought before Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah. There they slaughtered his sons before his eyes, and then they put out his eyes. The last image that man saw in his life was the death of his sons. A month later, the captain of the guard arrived in Jerusalem, and he burned the house of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of the city. The army tore down the walls. The soldiers dismantled the bronze pillars and cut them up to carry them away. They took the pots, the shovels, the snuffers, the dishes, and all the vessels of bronze used in the temple service. The passage even details the measurements of the pillars and their capitals. It's an inventory, cold, technical, precise. And that coldness is the most devastating thing about the chapter. The author doesn't weep. He doesn't curse Babylon. He doesn't write a lament. He enumerates, like someone drafting the minutes of a liquidation. Now remember where all this began. Those bronze pillars were described by their proper names in chapter 7 of the first book, when they were erected. They were given names, their height, their capitals, their bronze latticework. Their pomegranates were all detailed. The same author who devoted entire paragraphs to describing how they were made now devotes a paragraph to describing how they were cut to pieces. It's the same pen closing the circle. And then, after the execution of the chief priests, after the deportation, after the brief account of the governor they left behind who was also assassinated, after the last survivors fled to Egypt in fear, when the reader is prepared for the book to end, in the absolute silence of a burned city, 4 verses appear. And they are the 4 verses with which this video began. The text jumps 37 years forward. It says that in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, evil Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign, graciously freed Jehoiachin, king of Judah, from prison. And he spoke kindly to him, and gave him a seat above the seats of the kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiachin put off his prison garments, and he ate bread regularly before him all the days of his life. And his allowance, a regular allowance, was given him by the king according to his daily needs, every day of his life. There it ends. There is no return. There is no rebuilding of the sanctuary. There is no liberation army. There is no resurrection of the monarchy. There is a man of around 55 who comes out of a cell, takes off his prisoner's clothes, and sits down to eat. For centuries, that ending puzzled readers. It seemed an anticlimax. Some read it as an unimportant appendix. Why close 4 centuries of sacred history with a prisoner's menu? And then, in the excavations of Babylon, there appeared some 300 clay tablets with cuneiform writing. They were not religious or literary texts. They were administrative records. Lists of rations distributed from the royal storehouses to captives, craftsmen, and foreign personnel. 4 of those tablets contained a name, Jehoiachin, king of the land of Yahudu. That is, Jehoiachin, king of Judah. The registered allotments include oil and barley, and expressly mention 5 sons of the king of Judah. And there's a chronological detail that matters because it avoids an easy confusion. Those rations don't correspond to the moment of his release, which occurred many years later under a different ruler. They correspond to the years when he was still captive. What they document is not the end of the chapter, but the long wait that preceded it. Now notice the title the scribes give him. They call him king, not prisoner, not exile, not former ruler, king of the land of Yahudu. For the administration of the empire, that man was still legally the monarch of Judah, though he had been locked up for decades, and though there was another man sitting in Jerusalem. And that illuminates a conflict that appears in the prophetic books. Both Jeremiah and Ezekiel reflect a discussion about who the legitimate king was. The deported man, or the one Babylon had installed. Ezekiel, in fact, dates his visions counting the years of Jehoiachin's captivity, not the reign of the man governing in the city. And the second detail is the 5 sons, because the existence of descendants is exactly what turns those final verses into something other than a sad epilogue. Return now to the image of the lamp. It appears for the first time when the kingdom splits in 2. To Judah will be left 1 tribe, so that David may always have a lamp before God in Jerusalem. It reappears when an unworthy ruler should have lost the throne, and it is preserved for love of David. It never promises a bonfire. It promises a lamp, a flame the size of a hand, which nobody guarantees will grow, only that it will not go out. And in the chapter about Athaliah, that lamp was reduced to a baby hidden in a temple chamber for 6 years. And at the end of the book, it's reduced to a prisoner with 5 sons, eating at another king's table. Twice it nearly went out. Twice it stayed lit. It's not a restoration. It's far less than that. It's a seed. And do you know where that seed reappears 600 years later? And everything that comes after depends on that seed. Because 6 centuries later, when an evangelist sat down to write the genealogy that opens his book, he included in the list, among the generations of the deportation to Babylon, the name of that man, Jeconiah, who is the same as Jehoiachin. The prisoner of the clay tablets appears in the genealogy of Jesus. Now go back to the beginning and look at the whole from above. Melachim begins with an old man, dying, handing the throne to his son, and that son building the most glorious building in his world and praying at its dedication. And it ends with a descendant of that same lineage, captive in the empire that burned the building, receiving daily food from someone else's hands, from the throne to the ration, from the house of God to the table of Nebuchadnezzar. That arc is the complete argument. And it's also the answer to the question God anticipated in chapter 9, when not a single stone was yet out of place. Why did the Lord do this to this land and to this house? The work answers across 47 chapters, with archives, with repeated formulas, with 40 individual files, with a criterion applied without exception. It burned because the covenant was broken, systematically, for centuries, by those responsible for keeping it despite all the warnings, and that answer had an urgent function. The deportees who read those pages were about to disappear as a people, exactly as the northern kingdom had disappeared a century and a half before. The imperial deportation policy worked. Transplanted peoples dissolved in 2 or 3 generations. Judah did not dissolve. And one of the reasons was that it had a text that explained what had happened to it without obliging it to renounce its God. If the defeat had meant that the Lord lost, there would have been nothing to preserve. Babylon's gods were clearly stronger, and the sensible thing would have been to worship them. Malachim offers the opposite reading. It maintains that God did not lose, he judged, that the empire was a tool, not a victor, that the catastrophe, however horrendous, occurred within a story that still had meaning, and that reading made it possible for a people to survive its own annihilation. That's why the founder of the most documented dynasty of the North receives 6 verses, and a man dressed in hair who fled to the desert and asked to die receives entire chapters. It's not a proportional error, it's the thesis. And there's something more, something not written in any line, but running through the book from beginning to end. Every ruler on that list believed his reign was the important one. Each made decisions, thinking of his frontier, his treaty, his generation. The heir who lost 10 tribes did it by wanting to sound tough before an assembly. The one who showed the treasures to the Babylonians was relieved that the catastrophe wouldn't fall on him. And the work judges them all by a criterion none of them considered a priority. It didn't ask how many chariots they had. It asked what they did with the altars nobody demanded they touch. That man in Babylon, sitting at a table that wasn't his, eating bread given to him out of pity or political calculation, had no way of knowing his name would be written twice. Once in a Hebrew scroll and once in 4 clay tablets that a scribe wrote without thinking. Nor could he know that 600 years later, someone would write that same name in a list of generations that ended with a carpenter from Nazareth. He only knew that day they had taken off his prison clothes and that there was food, right below which of these pieces you had never seen before. Solomon's prayer, anticipating the exile on the day of the dedication. The baby hidden for 6 years inside the temple. The thin silence in the cave at Horeb. And if you know someone who reads the Bible every day without knowing that Kings is a single book classified as prophecy, share this video with that person. Subscribe to keep dismantling biblical texts layer by layer, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next one. You have 2 more videos waiting on screen. Choose either one and let's keep reading together. God bless you. Amen.